The coffee mug shattered against the marble floor, its contents spreading like dark blood across the pristine tiles. "Get out!" The manager's voice cut through the morning rush like a whip. "We don't serve beggars here." The old man stood frozen, his weathered hands trembling as 30 pairs of eyes bore into him with contempt. In that moment of crushing humiliation, only one person moved, a young waitress who would unknowingly change the course of 2 lives forever. If you're watching from New York, London, or anywhere between, stick around to see how 1 cup of coffee became the most expensive act of kindness ever given. Comment your city below. I'd love to know how far this story travels. The storm had been building since dawn, dark clouds gathering over the city like an army preparing for siege. By 7 in the morning, when Grace Bennett pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Sterling Cup, the rain was falling in sheets so thick she could barely see across the street. Water streamed from her umbrella as she shook it out in the entryway. Her reflection in the polished floor, showing a young woman already tired before her day had truly begun. "You're late." Marcus, the shift manager, didn't look up from his clipboard. His voice carried that particular brand of irritation reserved for those he considered beneath him, which in Marcus's world included most of humanity. 3 minutes, Grace said quietly, tying her apron around her waist. The bus is not my problem. Tables 4 through 12 need setting. The morning rush starts in 20 minutes. Grace nodded, already moving toward the supply station. She'd learned long ago that arguing with Marcus was like trying to reason with the storm outside, pointless and exhausting. The Sterling Cup was not the kind of place she'd ever imagined working. With its imported Italian marble floors, hand-blown glass chandeliers, and clientele who thought nothing of spending $50 on breakfast, it was a world away from the diner where she'd started 5 years ago. But the tips here could cover her sister's medical bills in a way her previous job never could. The cafe began filling as the city's financial district came to life. Investment bankers in tailored suits, lawyers checking their phones between sips of organic fair trade espresso, tech executives conducting meetings over plates of eggs Benedict that cost more than Grace made in an hour. She moved between tables with practiced invisibility, refilling cups, taking orders, clearing plates. In places like this, good service meant being helpful, but never seen, present, but never heard. It was 8:47 when he walked in. The first thing Grace noticed was how the rain clung to him differently than it did to the others. While the morning's previous arrivals had burst through the door, shaking off designer umbrellas and waterproof trenches, this man seemed to carry the storm with him. His coat, once navy blue perhaps, had faded to the color of forgotten dreams. Water dripped steadily from its hem, creating a small puddle that grew with each shuffling step he took toward the counter. His face was a map of years lived hard. Deep lines carved channels from the corners of his eyes, which were a startling blue, like looking at the sky through broken glass. His hair, white and thin, was plastered to his scalp by the rain. His shoes, Grace noticed with a pang of recognition, had newspaper stuffed inside them, visible through a crack in the leather. He stood at the counter for a full minute before Diane, the head barista, acknowledged him. Grace watched from table 7, where she was taking an order from a woman who couldn't decide between almond and oat milk, as Diane's expression shifted from professional politeness to barely concealed disgust. "Can I help you?" Diane's tone suggested she'd rather do anything but. The old man's voice was soft, refined in a way that seemed at odds with his appearance. "I'd like a coffee, please. Just black." "That'll be $6.50. Grace saw him reach into his coat pocket, his movements slow and careful. He pulled out a wallet, cracked leather held together with a rubber band, and opened it. His fingers, she noticed, were trembling slightly. Whether from cold or age, she couldn't tell. He searched through the wallet once, then again. His movements became more frantic, patting his other pockets, checking the wallet a third time. The line behind him was growing. A man in a Hermes tie checked his Rolex audibly. A woman in Louboutins tapped her heel against the marble floor in a staccato rhythm of impatience. I'm sorry, the old man said, his voice now barely above a whisper. I was certain. Sir, if you can't pay, you need to step aside. Diane's voice had risen, drawing attention from nearby tables. Please, I just need a moment. I know I had a 20. I always keep emergency money. This is ridiculous, the man with the Hermes tie interjected. Some of us have actual jobs to get to. The old man turned slightly, and Grace saw his face fully for the first time. There was something in his expression, not just embarrassment, but a deep, crushing sorrow, as if this moment was confirming something he'd suspected about the world, but had hoped wasn't true. I'm sorry, he said again to no one in particular. I'll go. That's when Marcus appeared. Grace had seen Marcus angry before, at suppliers who delivered late, at employees who made mistakes, at customers who complained. But this was different. This was Marcus seeing an opportunity to perform, to demonstrate his authority in front of the kind of clientele he desperately wanted to impress. Is there a problem here? Marcus's voice boomed across the cafe. This gentleman is trying to order without money, Diane explained, emphasizing gentleman in a way that made it sound like an insult. Marcus looked the old man up and down, his lip curling. Sir, this is a respectable establishment. We don't serve people who can't pay. I understand. I'm leaving. The old man began to turn, but Marcus wasn't finished. No, I don't think you do understand. Marcus stepped closer, his voice rising. People like you think you can just walk in here dripping all over our floors, disturbing our customers, wasting our time. Marcus, Grace heard herself say, setting down her order pad. She was moving toward the counter before she'd made the conscious decision to do so. Stay out of this, Bennett. Marcus didn't even look at her. Sir, I'm going to ask you once more to leave or I'll call security. The old man's hands were shaking more visibly now. I'm going. I'm sorry. You didn't mean what to beg. Because that's what this is, isn't it? You thought someone would take pity on you, buy your coffee. That's enough. Grace's voice cut through the cruel theater Marcus was performing. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, part of her tips from yesterday money she'd planned to put toward groceries. I'm paying for his coffee. The cafe fell silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to pause its hissing. Marcus turned to her slowly, his face reddening. What did you just say? I said I'm paying for his coffee. Grace placed the bill on the counter, her hand steady despite the racing of her heart. Black coffee, $6.50. Keep the change for the next person who's short. You're paying for him. The woman in Louboutin said it like Grace had announced she was funding terrorism. Yes. Grace turned to the old man whose blue eyes were wide with surprise. Sir, please, have a seat wherever you'd like. I'll bring your coffee. Bennett, if you do this, Marcus started. What, you'll fire me for being kind? Grace met his gaze steadily. For treating someone with basic human dignity, for encouraging vagrants, for buying a man a cup of coffee when he needs one. Grace's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. That's all I'm doing, Marcus. Buying coffee in a coffee shop. The old man hadn't moved. He stood frozen between the counter and the door, as if caught between two worlds. Sir, Grace said gently. Please. It's warm in here, and it's still pouring outside. Have a seat. I can't accept this, he said quietly. It's not charity, Grace said loud enough for everyone to hear. It's coffee between two people who could both use a kind moment on a difficult morning. Something shifted in the old man's face. He nodded once slowly and made his way to a corner table by the window. Grace poured his coffee herself, using the good beans they reserved for special orders, not the regular blend. She carried it to his table, aware of every eye in the café following her movement. "Thank you," he said, as she set the cup before him. Up close, she could see that his eyes, despite their weariness, held an unusual clarity, an intelligence that seemed to be taking in everything around him with minute precision. "You're welcome." She started to turn away, then paused. "I'm Grace, by the way." "Charles," he replied. "Charles Smith." The pause before Smith was barely noticeable, but Grace caught it. She didn't press. Everyone was entitled to their secrets. "Well, Charles, you enjoy your coffee. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked back to her section, she could feel the weight of judgment from both customers and co-workers. Diane shook her head in disgust. Marcus's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. The man with the Hermes tie was loudly telling his companion about the decline of standards in this city. But Grace didn't care. She'd kept a promise she'd made long ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, holding her sister's hand as machines beeped their electronic prayers. The morning rush continued, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the Sterling Cup. Grace went about her duties, taking orders, serving food, clearing tables, but she was aware of the old man, Charles, sitting quietly in his corner. He held the coffee cup with both hands, as if drawing warmth not just from the liquid, but from the gesture itself. He didn't drink quickly, but took small, deliberate sips, making it last. As she passed his table while serving a nearby customer, she heard him speaking softly to himself, or perhaps to someone who wasn't there. "You were right, Margaret," he whispered to the rain-streaked window. "You were always right." An hour passed. The storm outside had intensified, turning the morning into an artificial twilight. The café had filled with the sound of rain drumming against the windows, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder. Charles remained at his table, his coffee long finished, but no one had asked him to leave. Even Marcus, after his initial fury, had been called away to deal with a delivery issue. Grace brought Charles a refill without being asked, waving away his protests. "I can't. It's yesterday's coffee," she lied. "We have to throw it out anyway." He looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through her lie. But he accepted the cup with a gracious nod. "May I ask you something?" he said, as she turned to go. "Of course." "Why did you do it, really?" Grace considered giving him an easy answer. It was nothing anyone would have done the same, but something about his gaze demanded honesty. "My sister," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "She's sick. Has been for 3 years now. Multiple sclerosis. She's 24. She paused, unsure why she was telling this stranger her story. "When she was first diagnosed, we were at our lowest point. No insurance, no savings, no hope. We went to a pharmacy to fill her first prescription, and when we couldn't afford it, we just stood there crying." Charles said nothing, but his attention was complete. "This woman, we never knew her name. She was behind us in line. She paid for the medication. $300 just like that. When we tried to thank her to get her information so we could pay her back, she said something I've never forgotten." "What did she say?" "She said kindness isn't a loan, it's a gift. Pass it on when you can." Grace smiled at the memory. "So I do. When I can. Even if it's just a cup of coffee." Charles was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Your sister is fortunate to have you. I'm fortunate to have her." Grace glanced around, making sure Marcus hadn't returned. She's the strong one. Even on her worst days, she finds something to be grateful for. Yesterday, it was the way the light came through our apartment window, made a rainbow on the wall from the crystal she hung there. Margaret would have liked her, Charles said almost to himself. My wife. She passed 6 months ago. I'm sorry. She was ill for a long time. Alzheimer's. He stared into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers. Toward the end, she didn't know me, but she knew kindness. She would smile at the nurses, thank them for everything, even when she couldn't remember their names or where she was. The day before she died, she held my hand and said, "You're very kind to sit with me, stranger." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached out and gently touched his shoulder. She knew you. Maybe not your name or your face, but she knew your kindness. That's who you were to her, the kind stranger who stayed. Charles looked up at her, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I should go, he said, suddenly standing. I've taken enough of your time. You don't have to. No, I should. He straightened his wet coat with dignity. But thank you, Grace, for more than the coffee. He walked toward the door, his gait steadier than when he'd arrived. Just before he reached it, he turned back. Your sister, he said. What's her name? Hope, Grace replied. Her name is Hope. Charles smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Of course it is. Then he was gone, walking into the storm as if it were sunshine. The rest of Grace's shift passed in a blur of confrontation and consequence. Marcus, returning from his delivery crisis, had heard about the incident from Diane and several eager to gossip customers. My office. Now, he barked at Grace during a brief lull. His office was a cramped space behind the kitchen that smelled of burnt coffee and his excessive cologne. The walls were covered with motivational posters that proclaimed things like, "Excellence is not an option," and "Customers are always right." Sit, he commanded, though there was nowhere to sit except a broken chair stacked with inventory folders. Grace remained standing. Do you have any idea what you've done? Marcus's face was flushed, a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. I bought a man a coffee. You undermined my authority in front of customers, premium customers, the kind of customers who keep this place running, who pay your salary. I paid for the coffee myself. That's not the point. Marcus slammed his hand on the desk, making a cup of pens jump. The point is image, reputation. The Sterling Cup has a certain standard, a certain clientele. We can't have every homeless person in the city thinking they can just wander in here for free handouts. He wasn't asking for handouts. He thought he had money. He knew exactly what he was doing. They always do. It's a scam, Bennett. They come in, pretend they forgot their wallet, hope some bleeding heart like you will pay for them. Grace thought of Charles's eyes, the genuine distress when he couldn't find his money the way he'd tried to leave immediately. You don't know that. I know enough. I know that 3 customers complained. I know that Mrs. Wellington, who spends $200 here a week, said she's considering taking her business elsewhere because she doesn't feel safe anymore. Safe, he was an old man who couldn't find his wallet, not a criminal. The distinction doesn't matter to our customers. Marcus pulled out a formal-looking document. This is a written warning, first and last. You pull anything like this again, you're gone. Grace looked at the paper. It cited insubordination, creating a hostile work environment, and conduct detrimental to business interests. Hostile work environment. I bought someone a coffee. Sign it. Grace picked up the pen, her hand hovering over the signature line. She thought of Hope, of the medical bills that arrived with depressing regularity, of the specialized treatment they were saving for, that might slow the progression of her disease. She signed. "Get back to work," Marcus said, already turning to his computer. "And Bennett, that soft heart of yours, it's going to cost you everything one day." Grace returned to the floor where Diane greeted her with a cold smile. "Hope it was worth it," she said. "Your little charity case, he's probably spending that coffee money on booze by now." Grace didn't respond. She spent the rest of her shift in a fog of automatic motions: smile, take order, serve, clear, repeat. The rain had stopped by afternoon, leaving the city washed and gleaming, but she barely noticed. Her mind kept returning to Charles, to the way he'd said his wife's name, Margaret, like it was a prayer. By the time her shift ended at 3, Grace was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She changed out of her uniform in the small employee bathroom, catching sight of herself in the mirror. 28 years old, but the face looking back at her seemed older. When had those lines appeared around her eyes? When had her smile become something she put on with her apron? The bus ride home took 45 minutes, winding through neighborhoods that grew progressively shabbier the farther they got from the financial district. Grace watched the city transform outside the rain-spotted window, gleaming skyscrapers giving way to office buildings, then retail strips, then apartment complexes, with laundry hanging from balconies and children playing in puddles on cracked sidewalks. Home was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator had been broken for 3 months, and the stairwell smelled perpetually of cabbage and disappointment. But when Grace opened the door to apartment 4B, she was greeted by the sound of laughter. Hope was on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, video chatting with someone. Despite the IV port visible on her arm and the walker positioned nearby, she was radiant. Her smile when she saw Grace was like sunrise. "Gracie, perfect timing. I'm talking to Andre from my support group. Andre, this is my sister, the one I told you about." On the screen, a young man with a bright smile waved. "The famous Grace Hope talks about you all the time." "All lies, I'm sure," Grace said, managing a genuine smile. "All wonderful truths," Andre corrected. "I'll let you two catch up. Hope, think about what I said about the clinical trial, okay?" "I will. Thanks, Andre." After Hope closed the laptop, Grace sat beside her on the couch, noticing the new tremor in her sister's left hand. "How was today?" "Good day," Hope said, which was what she always said. In her vocabulary, there were good days and better days, never bad ones. "I did my exercises, made it all the way to the kitchen and back twice without the walker. And Mrs. Chen from downstairs brought soup." "That's wonderful." Grace kicked off her shoes, curling her feet under her. "The trial Andre mentioned. It's in Boston. Experimental treatment. Insurance won't cover it, of course." Hope said it matter-of-factly without bitterness. "But that's okay. We'll figure it out. We always do." Grace thought of the $10 she'd spent on Charles's coffee, felt a flutter of guilt, then pushed it away. $10 wouldn't make a difference to the mountain of medical debt. But it had made a difference to Charles. She was sure of that. "Something happened today," Grace said, and found herself telling Hope the whole story. Her sister listened without interrupting, her eyes bright with interest. "You did the right thing," Hope said when Grace finished. "You know that, right? Marcus doesn't think so. Neither do the customers. Since when do we care what people like that think?" Hope reached out with her good hand taking Grace's. "Remember what Mom used to say, the measure of a person isn't in their wallet, but in their willingness to share whatever they have." "Mom also said, don't talk to strangers and eat your vegetables," Grace pointed out. "We ignored those pretty regularly." Hope laughed, the sound filling the small apartment like music. "True, but this one stuck, didn't it?" Besides, I have a feeling about your Charles. He's not my Charles. I just mean there was something about him wasn't there the way you describe him, like he was carrying more than just the rain. Grace thought about it. Yeah, there was something. Probably just a man grieving his wife looking for some warmth on a cold day. Maybe, Hope said, but her tone suggested she thought otherwise. Or maybe the universe put you both exactly where you needed to be. Since when do you believe in that stuff? Since I got sick, Hope said simply. I've had a lot of time to think about coincidences and connections, about how the worst things and the best things sometimes come wrapped in the same package. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon sun paint golden stripes across the worn carpet. Finally, Hope spoke again. I've been thinking about applying for a job. Grace turned sharply. Hope you can't. Not a real job, online, freelance writing. I found this website where people pay for articles. Nothing fancy, but I could do it from here on my own schedule. You need to focus on your health. I need to focus on living, Hope corrected gently. On being more than just my illness. On contributing something. Grace wanted to argue to protect her sister from any additional strain, but she saw the determination in Hope's eyes. The same determination that had gotten her through the initial diagnosis, through the failed treatments, through the days when her legs wouldn't work, and her hands shook too badly to hold a cup. Okay, Grace said, but you take it slow. And the moment it becomes too much, I'll stop, I promise. Hope squeezed her hand. Now what should we have for dinner? And don't say cereal again. They ended up making pasta with the vegetables Mrs. Chen had included with her soup. It was simple fare, but Hope insisted on setting the table properly with their mother's good plates and the candles they usually saved for special occasions. What's the occasion? Grace asked. Tuesday, Hope replied. We're here, we're together, and it's Tuesday. That's occasion enough. As they ate, Hope told stories from her online support group, managing to find humor even in the darkest situations. She had a gift for that finding light, where others saw only shadow. Grace wondered sometimes if she'd been born with it, or if it was something that grew from facing mortality so young. After dinner, Grace helped Hope with her evening medications, 7 pills of various colors and sizes each with its own purpose and side effects. Then they settled in to watch a movie on Hope's laptop, some romantic comedy that Hope loved, and Grace pretended to hate, but secretly enjoyed. Halfway through, Hope fell asleep, her head on Grace's shoulder. Grace stayed perfectly still, not wanting to wake her, thinking about the strange day she'd had. She thought about Charles, wondering where he was now, if he had somewhere warm to sleep. She thought about Marcus's threat, about the precariousness of their situation. One job. That's all that stood between them and disaster. But then Hope shifted in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like "thank you," and Grace felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness. They would make it work. They always had. Later, after she'd helped Hope to bed and was lying on her own narrow mattress, Grace stared at the ceiling and thought about kindness, about the woman in the pharmacy 3 years ago, about Charles and his Margaret, about all the small gestures that held the world together when everything seemed to be falling apart. She was just drifting off to sleep when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Thank you again for today. Your kindness meant more than you know. I hope your sister continues to find rainbows. C. Grace sat up, fully awake now. How had he gotten her number? She hadn't given it to him, hadn't even told him her last name. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally settling on, "You're welcome. Take care of yourself, Charles." 3 dots appeared showing he was typing. They appeared and disappeared several times as if he too was struggling with what to say. Finally, the world needs more people like you, Grace Bennett. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He knew her last name. Grace stared at the message, a strange feeling creeping over her. Who was Charles Smith, and why did she have the feeling that the coffee she'd bought him was the beginning of something, not the end? Outside it began to rain again, a gentle patter against the windows that sounded almost like applause. In the next room, Hope coughed in her sleep, then settled. Grace lay back down, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another confrontation with Marcus, another day of serving people who looked through her like she was made of glass. But tonight, she'd stood up for something. She'd kept a promise. She'd been the person her mother raised her to be, the person Hope believed she was. The rain continued its soft percussion on the windows, and Grace finally drifted off to sleep, her phone still clutched in her hand, the mysterious message glowing in the darkness like a small beacon of possibility. She dreamed of coffee and kindness, of storms and strangers, of a man with eyes like broken sky who knew her name without being told. And somewhere in the city, in a penthouse apartment that overlooked the glittering lights of downtown Charles Everett Worthington III, not Smith, never Smith, stood at his window and watched the same rain fall. He thought about his test, about the cruelty he'd witnessed, and the single act of kindness that had restored something he thought he'd lost forever. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see him now. "You found her," he said to the night, to the memory of his wife, to the reflection of an old man who'd remembered what it meant to hope. "You told me I would, and I found her." The rain fell on the just and the unjust alike, on the Sterling Cup, and the shabby apartment building, on the wealthy and the poor, the kind and the cruel. It washed the city clean for another day, another chance, another opportunity to choose who to be, in the small moments that in the end were never small at all. And in her sleep, Grace smiled, not knowing that her simple act of kindness had set in motion something that would change not just her life and hopes, but the lives of countless others who would learn that sometimes the price of a cup of coffee could be worth more than all the money in the world. The storm passed by morning, leaving the city gleaming and new, ready for whatever came next. Part 2: Echoes of Kindness. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful normalcy. Grace went to work, served coffee to people who barely acknowledged her existence, dodged Marcus's increasingly hostile glares, and came home to care for Hope. But something had shifted in the careful architecture of her routine. She found herself glancing toward the corner table where Charles had sat, half expecting to see him there, nursing his coffee with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to hold entire histories. On Thursday morning, the absence felt particularly acute. The corner table was occupied by a young couple more interested in their phones than each other, and Grace felt an unexpected pang of loss. She'd been checking her phone too, rereading that mysterious text message, wondering how Charles Smith had known her full name, why his simple words of encouragement felt weighted with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. "You're distracted," Diane observed, not kindly, as Grace accidentally gave a customer regular milk instead of soy for the 3rd time that week. "Let me guess, still thinking about your charity case." Grace didn't answer, but her silence seemed to confirm Diane's suspicion. The head barista laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the morning bustle like broken glass. "You really don't get it, do you? People like that, they're users. He probably tells that sob story at every cafe in the city. Dead wife forgot his wallet. It's the oldest con in the book." "You didn't see his face," Grace said quietly, remaking the customer's latte. "You didn't see how he looked when he talked about her." "Oh, honey." Diane's voice dripped with condescension. "You're so naive, it's almost sweet. Almost." Grace wanted to argue, to defend Charles, to explain that sometimes kindness didn't need to be earned or justified, but she knew it would fall on deaf ears. People like Diane had built walls so high around their hearts that they'd forgotten what the view looked like from the other side. The morning rush was particularly brutal. A convention had brought an influx of out-of-town visitors, all of them impatient, all of them demanding modifications to menu items that turned simple orders into complex chemistry experiments. Grace's feet ached, her head throbbed, and by noon she was running on muscle memory alone. That's when Marcus cornered her by the supply station. "Table 12 has been waiting for their order for 15 minutes. He hissed, his breath hot with the sourness of too much coffee and barely contained rage. "I just delivered it 5 minutes ago," Grace replied, checking her order pad. "Well, they're saying otherwise, and the customer is always right, aren't they, Bennett?" Grace bit back her response, knowing it would only make things worse. She went to table 12, where a middle-aged man in an expensive suit was indeed claiming he'd been waiting far longer than he had. She apologized, offered to comp his meal, and endured his lecture about the decline of service standards, with a fixed smile that felt like it might crack her face. When she finally escaped back to the kitchen, Miguel, one of the cooks, gave her a sympathetic look. "Saw the whole thing," he said quietly, sliding an extra pastry onto her tray. "That guy's been here 3 times this week, pulls the same stunt every time. Marcus knows it too." "Then why?" "Because that guy golfs with the owner's brother." Miguel shrugged. "Welcome to the Sterling Cup, where dignity goes to die." Grace wanted to laugh, but she was afraid if she started, it might turn into something else, tears maybe, or screaming. Instead, she pocketed the pastry to take home to Hope and went back to the floor. It was almost 2 o'clock, near the end of her shift, when he walked in again. Charles. But this was not the same man who'd shuffled in from the rain 3 days ago. This Charles stood straight, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a charcoal gray suit that Grace could tell even from across the room cost more than she made in 6 months. His shoes, Italian leather if she had to guess, clicked confidently against the marble floor as he walked directly to the counter. Diane was there, and Grace watched the barista's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and then a kind of horrified understanding. "Good afternoon," Charles said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of being listened to. "I'd like a black coffee, please." Diane's hands fumbled with the cup. Of course, sir, right away." "And," Charles continued, pulling out a wallet, not the cracked leather one from before, but something sleek and black that probably cost more than the pastry case, "I'd like to pay for the next 50 customers, whatever they order." The café seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The espresso machine's hiss sounded suddenly loud in the silence. "For 50 customers," Diane stammered. "Yes. And please add a $100 tip for the staff. Each staff member working today." Charles pulled out a black American Express card, the kind that had no limit, the kind that most people had only heard about. "Will this cover it?" Marcus materialized as if summoned by the presence of wealth. His face had undergone a complete transformation, the perpetual scowl replaced by an expression of such obsequious delight that Grace felt slightly nauseous. "Sir, welcome to the Sterling Cup. I'm Marcus, the manager. How can we make your experience exceptional today?" Charles turned those blue eyes on Marcus, and Grace saw the manager actually take a step back. There was something different about Charles now, a quiet power that filled the space around him like an electrical field. Yes, Marcus." Charles's tone was pleasant, conversational, even, but somehow it made Marcus flush. "I believe we met a few days ago. Different circumstances, of course." The color drained from Marcus's face as recognition dawned. "You're..." But you were. I was a man who'd forgotten his wallet, Charles said simply. And you were a man who chose cruelty when kindness would have cost you nothing. The entire café was watching now, the kind of hushed attention usually reserved for accidents or public proposals. Grace found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. Sir, I had no idea. No. Charles interrupted, his voice still calm. You had no idea I had money. That's quite different from having no idea, isn't it? You knew I was a human being. You knew I was elderly, wet from the rain, clearly distressed. You had all the information you needed to make a different choice. Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I was just maintaining standards. Were you? Charles accepted his coffee from Diane's trembling hands. And what standard is that exactly? The one that says human dignity is contingent on the thickness of one's wallet. He took a sip of the coffee, considering. Good coffee. Excellent, actually. It's a shame it comes with such poor humanity. Grace realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, watching as Charles turned from the counter. His eyes found hers across the room, and something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, something else she couldn't quite name. Miss Bennet? He said, and every head in the café swiveled toward her. Might I have a word? Grace felt Marcus's glare burning into her back as she approached. Of course. Charles gestured to the corner table, his table she'd come to think of it. They sat, and for a moment neither spoke. Up close she could see that the lines on his face were still there, but they seemed different somehow, not marks of hardship, but of experience, like a map of places traveled, rather than burdens carried. You knew, she said finally. That day, you knew exactly what you were doing. It wasn't a question, but Charles nodded anyway. I did. Why? He was quiet for a long moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands, a gesture she recognized from their first meeting. My wife died 6 months ago, he began, and his voice carried the same raw honesty it had that first day. Margaret, we were married for 47 years, built a life together, built a business together, built what we thought mattered. He paused. Do you know what she said to me near the end in one of her rare moments of clarity? Grace shook her head. She said, Charles, we have so much money and so little wealth. I didn't understand at the time. I thought it was the disease talking. But after she died, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Money and wealth. The difference. He looked around the cafe at the expensive decor, the well-dressed customers, the careful choreography of service and servitude. I spent months afterward just existing, going through motions. And then one day I decided to find out what she meant. I started going out without the trappings, the suit, the watch, the car and driver. I wanted to see what the world looked like when money wasn't the first thing people saw when they looked at me. And what did you find? Charles's smile was sad. Mostly what I expected. Cruelty, indifference. People who looked through me like I was invisible, or worse, looked at me like I was something offensive, something to be scraped off their shoe. He met her eyes. And then I found you. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. I just bought you a coffee. No, Charles said firmly. You saw me. Not my clothes or my wallet, or my potential value as a customer. You saw an old man who needed kindness, and you offered it without hesitation, even though it cost you, and I could see that it did cost you. That $10 wasn't nothing to you. How did you know my name? Grace asked. My full name. How did you get my number? Charles had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I have a private investigator on retainer. Old habits from the business world. I asked him to find out who you were. Grace stiffened. You investigated me. Just your name and a phone number, I swear. I didn't pry into your life, though. I admit I was tempted. I wanted to know what kind of person raises someone capable of such instinctive kindness. And now you know. Now I know that Grace Bennett works 60 hours a week to support herself and her sister. That Hope Bennett has been battling multiple sclerosis with a grace that puts the rest of us to shame. That your parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, leaving you to care for Hope alone. That you've been turned down for 3 loans trying to pay for treatments that might help her. Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You had no right. You're correct. I didn't. Charles remained seated, looking up at her with those impossible blue eyes. But I'm glad I did it anyway. Because now I can do this. He pulled out an envelope from his suit pocket and placed it on the table. What is this? It's a chance. Nothing more, nothing less. Grace didn't touch the envelope. I don't want your money. I know. That's precisely why I'm offering it. Charles stood now, straightening his suit. My wife was right. We had money but no wealth. You, Miss Bennett, have wealth that can't be measured in dollars. But dollars can buy time, and time is what your sister needs. This is crazy. You don't even know me. I know enough. Charles moved toward the door, then paused. The investigator found something else. The clinical trial in Boston that your sister's support group mentioned, I know the doctor running it. Margaret was treated at the same hospital. I've made a call. Hope has been accepted, fully funded transportation and accommodation included. Grace felt the world tilt. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. You can't just... I can, actually. The question is whether you'll let me. Charles smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes completely. You gave me something that day, Miss Bennett. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that Margaret was right to believe in people even when they disappointed her. Let me give something back. This is too much. The coffee was $6.50. No, Charles said softly. The coffee was $6.50. What you gave me was priceless. He walked to the door, then turned back one more time. Oh, and Marcus, you'll want to be very careful how you treat your employees from now on. I've just purchased a controlling interest in the Sterling Cup chain. We'll be making some changes starting with management. Marcus's face went from red to white so fast, Grace worried he might faint. Charles nodded to her once more, then walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving chaos in his wake. The envelope sat on the table like a live thing. Grace finally picked it up with trembling fingers, opening it carefully. Inside was a check that made her knees weak enough to cover Hope's treatment, their rent for a year, and then some. But it was the note attached that made her sink back into the chair. For Hope, who finds rainbows on the walls. For Grace, who makes them possible. This isn't charity, it's an investment in a world with more kindness in it. Use it well. Charles Everett Worthington III. P.S. The coffee really was excellent. The cafe erupted the moment Charles left. Customers pulled out phones, Googling his name, gasping at what they found. Charles Everett Worthington III, founder and CEO of Worthington Industries, net worth in the billions, known for his ruthless business tactics and recent reclusiveness following his wife's death. Holy shit! Someone whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. That was Charles Worthington. The Charles Worthington. Marcus stood frozen by the counter, his face cycling through expressions like a broken television. Diane had gone pale, remembering every snide comment she'd made about the old beggar. Grace barely heard any of it. She sat at the corner table, staring at the check, thinking about hope, about possibility, about the strange turns life could take when you least expected them. Bennett. Marcus's voice was different now, uncertain, almost pleading. About the other day. The warning. I think perhaps I was hasty. Were you? Grace looked up at him and something in her expression made him step back. Or were you just being yourself? She stood folding the envelope carefully and putting it in her pocket. I'll finish my shift. The customers deserve that. But I'm giving my 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately. You can't? Marcus started, then seemed to remember that the new owner had just witnessed his treatment of her. I mean, please reconsider. We value you as an employee. Grace almost laughed. 3 days ago, he'd threatened to fire her for buying a man coffee. Now he was practically begging her to stay. No, she said simply. You don't value me. You never have. You value what you think I can do for you now that you know Charles Worthington approves of me. She walked past him to the employee area to get her things. Miguel gave her a thumbs up from the kitchen. Even some of the customers applauded, though, whether for her or for the free coffee Charles had purchased, she couldn't tell. As she was leaving, Diane caught her arm. Grace, don't, Grace said, not unkindly. Just, next time someone needs help, remember that you don't know their story. You don't know who they are, or who they might become, or who loves them. All you know is that they're human, and that should be enough. She left the Sterling cup for what she thought would be the last time stepping out into the afternoon sun. The city looked different, somehow brighter, full of possibility she hadn't seen that morning. Her phone buzzed, Hope texting to ask if she could pick up milk on the way home. Grace smiled, texting back, I'll pick up milk and champagne. We have something to celebrate. The walk to the bus stop felt like floating. She kept touching the envelope in her pocket, making sure it was real. A woman asked her for directions, and Grace not only told her, but walked her to the corner to make sure she saw the right street. A homeless man sat against a building, and Grace dropped a 20 in his cup, one of her last 20s, but it didn't matter anymore. The bus ride home was the same route she'd taken hundreds of times, but everything looked different when you weren't seeing it through the lens of exhaustion and worry. The neighborhoods didn't look shabby. They looked lived in. The children playing in puddles weren't neglected. They were joyful. When she reached the apartment building, the broken elevator didn't matter. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her feet barely touching the ground. She burst through the door of 4B to find Hope exactly where she'd left her, on the couch with her laptop, but something was different. Grace. Hope set the laptop aside, concerned. What's wrong? You look... Pack a bag, Grace said, grinning so wide her face hurt. We're going to Boston. What, Grace? What are you talking about? Grace pulled out the envelope, the check, the note. Watched Hope's eyes go wider, then fill with tears. This can't be real. It's real. Grace sat beside her sister, pulled her close. The clinical trial, the treatment, everything. It's really happening. Hope was crying now, great gasping sobs that shook her whole body. But how, who? So Grace told her everything. About Charles and his test, his wife Margaret, the cruelty he'd witnessed, and the kindness he'd been searching for. About the coffee and the text, and the revelation today. Hope listened, tears streaming down her face, occasionally laughing at the absurdity of it all. You bought a Billionaire coffee, she said finally. My sister bought a Billionaire coffee because he forgot his wallet. He didn't forget it, Grace corrected. He was testing people. And you passed. We passed, Grace said firmly. You're the one who taught me to be kind, Hope. Every day watching you face this disease with such grace, never becoming bitter, never stopping believing in good things, you taught me that. Hope shook her head. I learned it from you, from the way you gave up everything to take care of me. I didn't give up anything that mattered. They held each other for a long time, crying and laughing in equal measure. Finally, Hope pulled back, wiping her eyes. We should call the hospital, make arrangements. Already done, Grace said. Charles, Mr. Worthington, he arranged everything. We leave Monday. There's a furnished apartment near the hospital waiting for us. This is insane. I know. This doesn't happen in real life. I know. Grace, what if it doesn't work, the treatment? Grace took her sister's hands, feeling the tremor that was always there, now worse in the evenings. Then we'll have tried, and we'll have done it without going into debt, without me working myself to death, without you feeling guilty about being sick. That alone is a gift. Hope nodded, then smiled that sunrise smile that could light up the darkest room. We should celebrate. Where's that champagne you mentioned? Grace laughed. I haven't bought it yet. I was too excited to stop. Well, go and get the good stuff. We're apparently friends with a billionaire now. Grace stood to leave, then paused. Hope, what do you think Mom would say about all this? Hope considered. I think she'd say that kindness creates ripples and you never know how far they'll travel. And then she'd probably ask if Charles has any single sons. Grace threw a pillow at her sister, who caught it despite her trembling hands, and threw it back, laughing. For a moment, they were just sisters, not patient and caregiver, not struggling and sacrificing. Just two young women with their whole lives ahead of them, lives that had suddenly cracked open with possibility. Grace went to buy champagne, choosing a bottle that cost more than she'd ever spent on alcohol in her life. The cashier, the same one who usually rang up her careful purchases of generic groceries, raised an eyebrow. Special occasion. You could say that, Grace said, smiling. My sister got into a clinical trial. Full funding. We're moving to Boston on Monday. That's wonderful. Medical trials are so expensive these days. They are, Grace agreed. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, you meet someone who reminds you that there's still magic in the world. The cashier looked confused, but Grace didn't elaborate. Some stories were too strange for casual tellings, too precious to be reduced to checkout line small talk. Back at the apartment, she and Hope drank champagne from their mother's good glasses, the ones they'd been saving for a special occasion that they'd never quite defined. They talked about Boston, about the trial, about the future, a word that had felt too dangerous to use for so long. What will you do? Hope asked. While I'm in treatment, you won't have to work, at least not right away. Grace hadn't thought about it. For 3 years, her life had been work and hope and work. The idea of having time, of having choices, was almost frightening. Maybe I'll take a class, she said slowly. Remember how I wanted to be a social worker before Mom and Dad? You'd be amazing at that, Hope said immediately. You could help people. Professionally, I mean, not just buying coffee for stray billionaires. They laughed. But Grace was thinking about it seriously now. She had enough money to go back to school to finish her degree, to become the person she'd planned to be before life had derailed those plans. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number, but she recognized it now, Charles. I hope you've told Hope the good news. The team in Boston is expecting you Monday. If you need anything before then, anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. Grace showed the message to Hope, who immediately grabbed the phone and started typing. Hope, what are you doing? Inviting him to dinner, Hope said, continuing to type. The man changed our lives. The least we can do is feed him. Hope, he's a billionaire. He doesn't want to have dinner in our tiny apartment. But Hope had already sent the message. You don't know that. He went to all that trouble to test people's kindness. Maybe he's lonely. Maybe he misses having normal conversations with normal people. Grace's phone rang 30 seconds later. Charles's name appeared on the screen. He must have added himself to her contacts somehow. She answered with trepidation. "Miss Bennett, I just received a charming invitation from your sister." "I'm so sorry," she grabbed my phone. "I would be delighted to accept if the invitation is genuine." Grace paused, surprised. "Really? Really? It's been a very long time since anyone invited me to dinner without wanting something from me. Well, something other than my company. We don't have anything fancy. Hope's having a good day, but she can't cook, and I'm not exactly a gourmet chef. Miss Bennett, Grace, I've eaten at the finest restaurants in the world. Do you know what they all have in common? No one ever really tastes the food. They're too busy performing, networking, impressing each other. A real dinner with real people sounds perfect." They set a time for the next evening, and Grace hung up in a daze. "He's coming?" Hope asked, delighted. "He's coming. Hope, we're having a billionaire to dinner in our tiny apartment, and I don't even have a dining table that doesn't wobble. So we'll put a book under the leg like always," Hope said practically. "Grace, he doesn't care about our apartment. He cares about us. Well, about you." "About us," Grace corrected. "He mentioned you specifically in his note." They spent the rest of the evening planning the menu, something simple but good. Hope insisted on helping with what she could, washing vegetables, her hands moving slowly but determinedly. They worked together in the tiny kitchen, music playing from Hope's laptop, and for the first time in years, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. That night, Grace lay in bed thinking about Ripples, about the woman in the pharmacy 3 years ago who'd paid for Hope's medication. Had that act of kindness somehow led to this? If that woman hadn't helped them, would Grace have been in a position to help Charles? Would she have even noticed him, or would she have been too hardened by her own struggles? She thought about Charles alone in what was probably a massive house, missing his wife, testing strangers to see if kindness still existed. How lonely must he have been to go to such lengths? How desperate to find proof that Margaret had been right about people. In the morning, she would call the hospital in Boston, start making real plans. She would give her official notice at the Sterling Cup, though she doubted Marcus would require her to work the full 2 weeks. She would begin the process of packing up their life here, preparing for something new. But tonight, she simply lay in the dark, listening to Hope's breathing from the next room, steady and peaceful, for once not labored with pain or medication side effects. She thought about kindness and coffee, about tests and chances, about the way life could pivot on a single moment of choosing compassion over indifference. Her phone lit up with one more message from Charles. "Thank you for saying yes to dinner. Margaret always said the best meals were the ones shared with friends. I haven't had one of those since she died." Grace typed back. "We're looking forward to it. Hope says to tell you she's making her famous brownies. They're only famous in our apartment, but still. I'm honored to be included in such an exclusive club." Grace smiled in the darkness. 3 days ago, she'd bought a stranger coffee. Tomorrow, that stranger would sit at their wobbly table and eat Hope's brownies, and somehow that felt exactly right. Life, she was learning, was less about the big moments than the small choices, to see people, to offer help, to accept grace when it was offered in return. Outside, the city hummed with its usual nighttime symphony, sirens and car horns, music from a neighbor's apartment, someone laughing on the street below. But tonight, it sounded different. Tonight, it sounded like possibility. The next morning arrived with an unusual clarity, the kind of light that made even their worn apartment look almost magical. Grace woke early, her mind already racing through dinner preparations, while the Hopaison sat at the kitchen counter, her hands steadier than they'd been in weeks, carefully writing out a grocery list in her meticulous handwriting. We need fresh rosemary, Hope said, tapping the pen against her lips. And good olive oil, not the cheap stuff we usually get. Hope, we don't need to impress him. We're not impressing him. We're honoring him. Hope looked up, her eyes serious. This man saw you, Grace. Really saw you. In a world where people are invisible to each other, he made himself invisible to find someone who could see. That deserves our best effort. Grace couldn't argue with that logic. They spent the morning shopping together, Hope leaning on her walker, but insisting on coming along. At the specialty grocery store, Hope touched everything: the rough skin of lemons, the silk of fresh pasta, the cool glass bottles of olive oil imported from Italy. It was as if she was storing up sensations, building a library of experiences. $28 for olive oil, Grace muttered, but she put it in their basket anyway. For once, they could afford it. As they prepared the meal that afternoon, Grace's phone rang. It was Marcus, his voice strained and artificially pleasant. Grace, I wanted to call personally to apologize for any misunderstandings we may have had. Mr. Worthington has been very clear about his expectations for the Sterling Cup moving forward, and I realize I may have been overzealous in my management style. Grace put the phone on speaker so Hope could hear both of them, trying not to laugh at Marcus's painful attempt at humility. I appreciate the call, Marcus. I was hoping you might reconsider your resignation. We could discuss a significant raise, better hours, perhaps even a management position. No, thank you. There was a pause. Might I ask why? Grace thought about it. Because you're not sorry for how you treated me or Charles or anyone else you deemed beneath you. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry there were consequences. That's not the same as understanding why what you did was wrong. I've been with the company for 15 years. And in all that time, did you ever once buy coffee for someone who couldn't afford it? Did you ever see a person instead of a profit margin? Grace's voice was calm but firm. Mr. Worthington isn't punishing you for that one incident, Marcus. He's holding you accountable for who that incident revealed you to be. She hung up before he could respond. Hope was grinning at her. Look at you telling off your former boss like a badass. Language, Grace said automatically, though she was smiling too. Oh please, I'm 24, not 4. And I'm proud of you. The old Grace would have apologized, would have felt guilty. The old Grace didn't have options, Grace corrected. It's easy to be brave when you're not desperate. They worked in companionable silence after that, Hope sitting on a stool peeling potatoes, while Grace braised the chicken in wine and herbs. The apartment filled with the kind of aromas that usually only existed in their memories of their mother's kitchen. Hope had been right about the good ingredients. They made a difference, transforming their simple meal into something that smelled like comfort and abundance. At 6 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Grace had worried Charles might arrive in a limousine, drawing attention from the entire neighborhood. But when she opened the door, he stood alone in the hallway, holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of sunflowers. I remembered you mentioned Hope likes flowers that look happy, he said, almost shyly. He was dressed casually, khakis and a button-down shirt that probably cost more than their rent, but somehow didn't look ostentatious. He looked like what he was, a grandfather who'd been invited to dinner, not a billionaire slumming it with the poor. They're perfect, Grace said, taking the flowers. Hope will love them. Charles followed her into the apartment, and Grace watched him take in their space, the mismatched furniture, the medical equipment in the corner, the wall of photographs showing happier times with their parents. If he was judging, it didn't show on his face. Instead, he walked straight to the photo wall, studying each picture with genuine interest. Your parents? He asked, pointing to a photo of a couple laughing at some long-ago barbecue. Yes. That was about a year before the accident. You have your mother's smile, he observed, and Hope has your father's eyes. Before Grace could respond, Hope emerged from her bedroom, moving carefully with her walker, but wearing her favorite dress, the blue one that brought out her eyes. "Mr. Worthington," she said, extending her hand with a grace that belied her condition. "Thank you for coming." Charles took her hand gently, and Grace saw him notice the tremor, the careful way Hope had to concentrate on the movement. But his expression didn't change to pity, something both sisters had learned to recognize and hate. Instead, he smiled warmly. "Please call me Charles. And thank you for inviting me. It smells wonderful in here." They made their way to the small table which Hope had set with their mother's good dishes and the candles from their Tuesday night dinner. Charles sat without commenting on the book wedged under one table leg to keep it steady, though Grace saw his lips twitch with what might have been amusement or approval. The conversation started carefully, tentatively, like dancers learning each other's rhythm. Charles asked about Hope's diagnosis, but not in the invasive way strangers often did. He wanted to know how she was handling it emotionally, what helped on the hard days. Hope in turn asked about Margaret, giving Charles the space to talk about his wife in a way Grace suspected he hadn't been able to in months. "She was diagnosed 5 years before she died," Charles said, accepting a second helping of chicken. "The doctors said we'd have 2 years, maybe 3. Margaret decided those numbers were suggestions, not rules. She made it 5 years through sheer stubbornness and joy." "Joy?" Hope asked. She said if she was going to lose her memories, she wanted the last ones to be worth losing. "So we traveled not to fancy resorts, but to places she'd always wanted to see. Small towns with ridiculous attractions. The world's largest ball of twine. A museum dedicated entirely to mustard. She couldn't remember my name near the end, but she could describe in perfect detail the taste of ice cream from a shop in rural Montana." "That's beautiful," Hope said softly, "making joy a choice." "She would have liked you," Charles said. She had this theory that people who faced adversity with grace were the only ones worth knowing. She said comfort made people soft, but struggle revealed character. "Sounds like she and our mom would have been friends," Grace said. "Mom always said the measure of a person wasn't what they had, but what they did with it." Wise women, both of them. Charles raised his water glass in a toast. "To the women who shaped us." They clinked glasses, and the evening began to flow more naturally. Charles told stories of his early days building his business, the failures that preceded his success. Hope talked about her online support group, the friends she'd made around the world, who understood what it was like to have your body betray you while your mind remained sharp. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years, the weight she'd been carrying for so long temporarily lifted. When Hope brought out the brownies, slightly lopsided but rich with chocolate, Charles ate 2 pieces and declared them the best he'd had since his grandmother's. "You're being kind," Hope said, but she was beaming. "I'm being honest. You can taste the love in them. That's something you can't buy no matter how expensive the restaurant." As they moved to the living room for coffee, Hope's energy began to flag. Grace saw the familiar signs, the way she had to concentrate harder on each movement, the slight glaze that came to her eyes when the fatigue hit. Charles noticed too. "I should go," he said, starting to rise. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "No," Hope said quickly. "Please, I need to rest, but I don't want the evening to end. Grace, would you show Charles the roof? The sunset view is beautiful from up there." Grace recognized what her sister was doing, giving them time alone, but also giving herself permission to rest without feeling like she was ending the party. She helped Hope to her bedroom, making sure she had Waitress and her evening medications within reach. "I like him," Hope whispered. "He's sad but not broken. There's a difference." Get some rest. I'll check on you later. Grace returned to find Charles studying the photograph wall again, focused on a picture of her and Hope at Hope's college graduation just months before the diagnosis. She was going to be a teacher, Grace said. Elementary school. She had a job lined up and everything. Life rarely follows our plans, Charles said. The question is what we do with the detours. They climbed the narrow stairs to the roof, emerging into the evening air. The city spread out before them, bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. Charles stood at the railing, looking out at the view, and Grace saw him differently, in this light not as a billionaire or a test or a chance, but as a man carrying grief like a physical weight. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said. "Of course." "Your test going out without your wallet, seeing how people treated you, how many times did you do it?" Charles was quiet for a moment. 17 times. Different coffee shops, restaurants, even a grocery store once. You were the only one who helped. No one else. One woman offered to call the police, assuming I was confused. Several people told me about shelters. Most just wanted me gone. He turned to look at her. "But you saw me. Not a problem to be solved or avoided, but a person who needed kindness." "I saw my father," Grace admitted. "He was proud like you. He would have been mortified to forget his wallet to have to ask for help. I thought about how I'd want someone to treat him." "And that's exactly it," Charles said with sudden intensity. "You didn't help me because you recognized me or thought you'd get something from it. You helped because it was the right thing to do. Do you know how rare that is? It shouldn't be rare. No, it shouldn't. But it is." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket, not the check from yesterday, but something else. "Which is why I want to make you a proposition." Grace tensed. "Charles, you've already done so much. Please just listen." He handed her the envelope. Inside were architectural plans, drawings of a building she didn't recognize. "I own several properties in the city. This one has been empty for 2 years. I want to turn it into something Margaret would have loved, a place where kindness isn't rare." Grace studied the plans, slowly understanding. It was a community center, but more than that, a café on the ground floor, medical facilities on the second support group, meeting rooms on the third. The café would operate on a pay-it-forward model, Charles explained. Those who can afford it pay extra, creating a fund for those who can't. The medical facilities would provide free or low-cost treatment for people like Hope, people caught in the gap between poverty and adequate care. The support groups would be free, open to anyone who needed community. "This is incredible, but what does it have to do with me? I want you to run it." Grace nearly dropped the plans. "What, Charles? I'm not qualified." "You're exactly qualified. You understand what people need because you've needed it yourself. You know how to stretch resources because you've had to. Most importantly, you see people. Really see them. I wait tables. I'm not equipped to run something like this. You'd have help. A board of directors, medical professionals, business managers. But I need someone at the helm who understands the mission, who won't let it become another soulless charity that treats people like statistics." Charles moved closer, his eyes intense. "Grace, I could hire someone with an MBA and 20 years of nonprofit experience, but they wouldn't understand what it feels like to count out change for your sister's medication. They wouldn't know the shame of being turned away because you don't have the right insurance. You do." Grace stared at the plans, her mind racing. "This is... When Hope gets back from Boston, I was going to go back to school, finish my social work degree." "Do both," Charles said simply. "The center won't be ready for at least a year, construction permits, all of that." Go to school. Get your degree. Learn what you need to learn. The job will be waiting when you're ready. Why are you doing this, O'Reilly? Charles looked out at the city, now painted in shades of orange and pink. Margaret and I never had children. We tried for years, spent a fortune on treatments, but it never happened. We threw ourselves into building the business, instead told ourselves that was our legacy. But sitting with her at the end, watching her slip away, I realized money isn't a legacy. Buildings aren't a legacy. People are. The lives you touch, the kindness you spread, the changes you make, that's what survives. He turned back to Grace. You gave me hope that Margaret was right, that people are fundamentally good. They just need the opportunity to show it. This center, it's not charity. It's creating opportunities for kindness. And I can't think of anyone better to lead that effort than the woman who bought coffee for a stranger when she could barely afford her own. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Charles, I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. Take the plans, share them with Hope. No pressure, no timeline. Just think about it. They stood together watching the sun set, the city transforming from day to night. Grace thought about the strange path that had led them here, a forgot wallet, a cup of coffee, a moment of choosing kindness over indifference. She thought about Hope downstairs, resting, but not defeated, fighting, but still joyful. She thought about their parents, about the values they'd instilled that had survived even their absence. You're Margaret, Grace said finally. Tell me more about her. Charles smiled, and for the next hour, as the stars emerged one by one above the city, he painted a portrait of a remarkable woman through stories and memories. Margaret, who had started as a nurse and ended as a philanthropist. Margaret, who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. Margaret, who kept $100 bill hidden in her wallet, specifically to give to anyone who needed it. Margaret, who believed that love was not a finite resource but something that grew the more you gave it away. She would have adopted you both, Charles said at one point. The moment she heard your story, she would have been planning your futures, finding the best doctors for Hope, insisting you go back to school. She sounds wonderful. She was. She made me better than I was. The worst part of losing her wasn't the loneliness, it was losing the person who saw the best version of me and insisted I live up to it. You're still living up to it, Grace pointed out. This center helping Hope, changing things at the Sterling Cup, that's you being the man she saw. Charles was quiet for a long moment. I hadn't thought of it that way. Maybe that's why you needed to find someone who could see you, Grace suggested gently, to remind you that you're still worth seeing. They descended from the roof as the city settled into its nighttime rhythm. Back in the apartment, Grace checked on Hope, who was awake and eager to hear about their conversation. Charles sat with her for a few minutes, and Grace heard them laughing about something, Hope's voice bright despite her exhaustion. When Charles finally prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Thank you, he said simply. For dinner for the company, for reminding me what it feels like to be welcomed somewhere without agenda or artifice. You're welcome here any time, Grace said, and meant it. And you're welcome in my life, both of you, not as charity cases or projects, but as friends, real friends, the kind Margaret would have chosen. After he left, Grace sat with Hope, showing her the plans for the center, watching her sister's eyes grow wide with possibility. You have to do this, Hope said immediately. Grace, this is what you were meant to do. It's a huge responsibility. So was taking care of me. You managed that. That's different. You're my sister. And this would be your chance to be a sister to others. To be the person you needed when we were struggling. Hope traced the architectural drawings with one trembling finger. Mom and Dad would be so proud. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. Hope would go to Boston for treatment. Grace would go back to school, and somewhere in the future, a building would exist where kindness was currency and no one was turned away for inability to pay. But that was all still to come. Tonight, they were just two sisters in a small apartment, full of good food and new hope, believing for the first time in years that tomorrow might be better than today. The check from Charles sat on the coffee table, no longer seeming surreal, but like a bridge to something they'd almost stopped believing in, a future worth reaching for. Grace thought about Charles, probably alone now in his big house, surrounded by memories of Margaret. She picked up her phone and sent a simple text. "Thank you for dinner. Hope says you're welcome to her brownies any time. Margaret was right, you're worth seeing too." His response came quickly. "That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in 6 months. Sleep well, dear friends." The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Grace called the hospital in Boston, confirming Hope's admission to the trial. The coordinator, Dr. Sarah Chen, was warm and encouraging. "Mr. Worthington spoke very highly of your sister," she said. "We're looking forward to having her in the program. The results so far have been very promising." "How promising?" Grace tried to keep the desperate hope out of her voice. "I can't make guarantees, but 70% of our patients have shown significant improvement in symptoms, and 40% have achieved what we call functional remission, meaning they can return to most normal activities." 40%. It wasn't a cure, but it was hope with actual numbers attached. Hope, listening on speaker, asked, "What about the other 60%? Still show improvement in quality of life, reduction in pain, and slowing of progression. We've had no patients who didn't benefit at least somewhat from the treatment." After the call, Hope was quiet for a moment. "Then I want to be in the 40% who can go back to teaching." "You will be," Grace said firmly, though they both knew wanting something didn't make it true. They spent the next few days in a whirlwind of preparation. Grace gave her official notice at the Sterling Cup, and Marcus didn't even try to convince her to work out the 2 weeks. She suspected Charles had something to do with that. Her co-workers threw together a small goodbye party. Even Diane contributed to a gift card, though she still couldn't quite meet Grace's eyes. Miguel pulled her aside before she left for the last time. "Heard you're going to run some kind of community center," he said. "Maybe. Probably. I don't know yet. When you do, if you need a cook who makes a mean soup and doesn't mind working for something more important than tips from rich jerks, you let me know." Grace hugged him impulsively. "I will." The apartment began to transform as they packed. 3 years of accumulated medical supplies, of making do with less of life compressed into survival, all of it sorted into boxes, marked Boston, or storage, or donate. Mrs. Chen from downstairs cried when they told her they were leaving. "But only temporarily," Hope assured her. "We'll be back." "You better be. Who else will listen to my stories about my grandson?" Charles visited twice more before they left, once bringing a specialist to examine Hope and ensure she was stable enough for travel, once just to sit with them, Hopes, and help pack books. It was surreal watching a billionaire carefully wrap their paperback novels in newspaper, but he seemed to enjoy the mundane task. "I haven't packed anything myself in 30 years, he admitted. "It's oddly satisfying." "You can come do our laundry anytime you want that satisfaction," Hope offered, making him laugh. The night before they left for Boston, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood at the window looking out at the city that had been both prison and home for so long. Tomorrow everything would change. Hope would begin treatment that might give her back her life. Grace would start classes that might give her a new purpose. And somewhere in this city, construction would begin on a building dedicated to the radical idea that everyone deserved kindness. Her phone buzzed. Charles again. I know you're awake. Margaret always said the night before a big change is when we feel the weight of both what we're leaving and what we're moving toward. Grace typed back, what did she do about it? Made lists. Terrible lists. Grocery lists when we were about to travel internationally. To-do lists when she was in the hospital. She said the act of writing things down made the future feel manageable. Grace smiled, looking at the notebook on the coffee table where she'd been doing exactly that. Tell me about the first time you knew you loved her. The typing dots appeared and disappeared several times. Then she was volunteering at a free clinic where I'd gone to get stitches after a construction accident. I had no insurance, was too proud to admit I couldn't pay. She treated me like I was her most important patient of the day, even though I was just another broke kid with big dreams. When I tried to thank her, she said, everyone deserves care when they're hurt. I knew then I'd spend my life trying to be worthy of someone who believed that. You are worthy, Grace typed. She knew it then, and she'd know it now. You remind me of her. Not physically, but in the way you see the world. Like kindness is the default, not the exception. Hope says I'm too soft. Hope is protecting you. But the world needs soft people, Grace. We need people who choose gentleness, even when life has given them every reason to harden. They texted back and forth for another hour, until finally Grace felt tired enough to sleep. Her last message was simple. Thank you for seeing us, Charles. His response came just as she was drifting off. Thank you for teaching me to look. The morning of departure arrived gray and drizzly, as if the city was reflecting their mood. The apartment looked strange with their personal items packed away like a stage set between performances. Hope moved slowly, the stress and excitement affecting her more than she wanted to admit. Grace helped her dress, noticing how thin her sister had become, how prominent the bones in her shoulders were. I'm going to get better, Hope said, meeting Grace's eyes in the mirror. I can feel it. I know you are. A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace expected Charles's driver, who was taking them to the airport, but instead found Charles himself holding a small wrapped box. I wanted to see you off, he said, and to give Hope this. Hope opened the box with shaking hands. Inside was a silver bracelet with a small charm, a sunflower. It was Margaret's, Charles explained. She wore it during her treatment, said it reminded her that flowers always turn toward the light, even on cloudy days. Hope's eyes filled with tears. Charles, I can't. You can and you will. It's been sitting in a drawer for 6 months, serving no purpose. Margaret believed in purposeful things. Wear it, and think of it as 2 women cheering you on, one from memory, one from Boston. Grace helped Hope fasten the bracelet, the silver bright, against her pale wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. The ride to the airport was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Charles had insisted on upgrading their tickets to first class, ignoring Grace's protests. You'll need the extra room for Hope's comfort, he said, ending the discussion. At the airport, Charles helped them check in, then walked them to security. He hugged Hope first carefully, but warmly. Be brave, he told her, but also be patient with yourself. Healing isn't linear. Then he turned to Grace, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. This unlikely pair brought together by a moment of kindness. This isn't goodbye, he said firmly. This is see you soon. I'll visit Boston. You'll send updates. And when you come back, we'll build something beautiful together. The center, not just the center, a friendship. The real kind, the kind Margaret would have treasured. He hugged her then, and Grace felt the solidness of him, the reality of this strange new connection. As they went through security, Grace looked back once. Charles was still standing there watching them go, and she was struck by how different he looked from that first day, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. The weight was still there, the grief, but it no longer seemed to be crushing him. On the plane, Hope clutched Grace's hand during takeoff, the bracelet catching the light from the window. "Everything's changing," Hope whispered. "Everything," Grace agreed. "Are you scared? Terrified? But also excited? Is that weird?" "No, I think that's exactly right." As the plane climbed into the cloudy sky, breaking through into sunshine above, Grace thought about the strange journey that had brought them here. A coffee shop, a rainy day, a forgotten wallet that wasn't forgotten at all. Such small things that had led to such big changes. She pulled out her phone, typing a message to Charles. Above the clouds now. The sun was there all along, just hidden. "Thank you for helping us find it." His response came as they leveled off, heading toward Boston, and whatever came next. The sun was always there. You just needed someone to remind you to look up. Safe travels, dear friends. Hope was already asleep, her head on Grace's shoulder, the bracelet gleaming on her wrist like a promise. Grace looked out at the endless sky and allowed herself something she hadn't dared in so long. She imagined a future where Hope was healthy, where she had a purpose beyond survival, where kindness wasn't rare, but abundant. Somewhere below, Charles was probably being driven home to his empty house. But Grace knew now that empty wasn't the same as broken, and alone wasn't the same as lonely. They were all healing in their own ways, finding their paths back to who they were meant to be. The plane carried them forward toward Boston, toward treatment, toward hope, with a capital H, and hope with a small one. And in Grace's pocket, carefully folded, were the plans for a building that would stand as testament to the power of seeing people really seeing them in all their beautiful, messy, struggling humanity. The story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Boston revealed itself through a curtain of mist as their plane descended the city, sprawling beneath them like a promise written in concrete and glass. The furnished apartment Charles had arranged was in Beacon Hill, a 10-minute walk from the hospital, with tall windows that flooded the rooms with light and a small balcony where Hope could sit on good days. It was nothing like their cramped apartment back home, yet Grace found herself missing the familiar shabbiness, the known quantities of their old life. The first week at the hospital was a blur of tests, consultations, and procedures. Dr. Chen proved to be exactly as warm in person as she'd been on the phone, with a directness that Hope appreciated. "The treatment is intensive," she explained during their first meeting, her hands folded on the desk between them. "We're essentially resetting your immune system, teaching it to stop attacking your nervous system. There will be difficult days. Your body will fight us before it accepts the help." "I'm good at fighting," Hope said, her chin lifted despite the tremor in her hands. "I can see that." Dr. Chen smiled. "But this time you also need to be good at surrendering, at letting us carry some of the weight." Those words proved prophetic. The first round of treatment left Hope violently ill, her body rejecting the medications with a vengeance that terrified Grace. She spent 3 nights sleeping in the hospital chair, watching her sister's vital signs jumping at every beep from the monitors. On the 4th night, a nurse named Jerome gently but firmly sent her home. "Your sister needs you strong," he said, his Haitian accent soft but insistent. "You can't pour from an empty cup. Go home, shower, sleep in a real bed. I promise I'll call if anything changes." Grace reluctantly left, but instead of going to the apartment, she found herself in the hospital chapel, a small, quiet space that welcomed believers and doubters alike. She sat in the back row and finally let herself cry huge, gulping sobs that felt like they were being pulled from somewhere deep in her chest. She cried for Hope's suffering, for their parents who weren't here to help, for the unfairness of a disease that struck without reason or mercy. "It's good to let it out," a voice said beside her. Grace looked up to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb." "You didn't. I come here every day. My grandson is in the children's ward. Leukemia." The woman handed Grace a tissue. "I'm Ruth." "Grace, my sister has MS. She's in the trial." "Ah, Dr. Chen's trial. She's brilliant. Saved my neighbor's daughter 2 years ago when everyone else had given up." Ruth patted Grace's hand. "It's hard being the one who watches. Sometimes I think it's harder than being the one who's sick." "I feel guilty even thinking that." "Don't. Your pain doesn't diminish hers. There's enough suffering to go around, unfortunately." Ruth stood to leave, then paused. "There's a support group for family members. Tuesdays at 7 third floor conference room. You should come." Grace did go the following Tuesday and found a circle of people who understood the particular exhaustion of being a caregiver. There was Marcus, not her Marcus, thankfully, whose wife had Parkinson's. Jennifer, whose teenage son was paralyzed from a skiing accident. Robert, whose partner was dying from ALS. They shared stories and strategies, but mostly, they shared the relief of not having to explain or minimize their own struggles. Meanwhile, Hope's body began to accept the treatment. Slowly, incrementally, but undeniably. The tremor in her left hand lessened. She could walk the hospital corridor without her walker, though Jerome still followed close behind, ready to catch her if needed. Her appetite returned with a vengeance that made Grace laugh, watching her sister devour hospital food. She would have turned her nose up at weeks before. Charles visited on a Thursday, 3 weeks into the treatment. He brought New York bagels, which Hope had mentioned missing, and fresh flowers for their apartment. But Grace could see something was troubling him, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "What's wrong?" she asked while Hope was in treatment. Charles hesitated, then pulled out his phone, showing her an article from a business publication. The headline read, "Worthington's Folly Billionaire's Community Center Plan Called Fiscally Irresponsible by Board." "The board of directors is fighting me on the center," he explained. "They say it's too much money for something with no return on investment. But it's your money, isn't it? It's complicated. The company is publicly traded now. Even though I have controlling interest, the board has a fiduciary duty to shareholders. They're threatening to claim I'm not acting in the company's best interests." Grace felt anger rise in her chest. "So they're fine with you having billions, but not with you using it to help people? They're fine with charity that generates good PR. A gala here, a donation there. But a sustained project that will cost millions annually, that's harder to justify on a balance sheet." "What are you going to do?" Charles smiled, and there was something of the shrewd businessman in it. What Margaret would have done. Fight them with their own weapons. "I've been documenting the PR disaster at the Sterling Cup, the negative press about employee treatment. I'm proposing the center as a reputation rehabilitation project. It's cynical using corporate speak to justify human decency, but if that's what it takes..." "You're a good man, Charles Worthington," Grace said impulsively. "I'm trying to be. It's harder than I expected doing good. Being ruthless in business was simple. This, caring about outcomes beyond profit margins, it's complicated." That evening after Charles left, Hope was quiet. She sat on the balcony, despite the chill Margaret's bracelet catching the light from the street lamps. "I've been thinking about afterwards," she said, when Grace joined her with blankets and tea. After treatment. After I'm better. If I'm better. She held up a hand before Grace could protest. I need to say this. I've been thinking about what I want to do with whatever time I get, whether it's a year or 50 years. Okay. I still want to teach, but not in a traditional school. I want to teach kids who are sick kids in hospitals who are missing their education along with everything else. I want to bring school to them. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. That's perfect, Hope. And I want to write. Really write, not just blog posts for money. I want to write about this, about being sick and being more than sick. About the people I've met, the stories that no one tells because they're too focused on the tragedy to see the triumph. You should. You'd be brilliant at it. Hope turned to look at her sister. And you? Have you thought about what you want beyond the center? Grace had been so focused on Hope's treatment, on the immediate future, that she hadn't let herself think further. I don't know. Getting my degree running the center, if it happens, that seems like enough. It's not, though. What do you want for yourself, Grace? Not as my caregiver, not as Charles's project manager. What does Grace Bennett want? The question hung in the cold air between them. Grace realized she didn't know how to answer it. For so long, her wants had been simple. Keep Hope alive, keep them housed, keep going. The possibility of wanting more felt almost greedy. I want to matter, she said finally. I want to wake up knowing that the day ahead has purpose, that I'm not just surviving, but building something. You already matter. I know. But I want to matter to more people. I want to be the person I needed when we were at our lowest. Grace pulled the blanket tighter around them both. And honestly, I want to fall in love. I want someone to look at me the way Charles looked at Margaret when he talked about her. Is that stupid? It's human, Hope said simply. And you deserve it. You deserve everything good, Grace. You've earned it 1,000 times over. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle below. Boston was starting to feel less foreign, the rhythms of hospital and apartment treatment and recovery becoming familiar. Grace had enrolled in online classes that would start the following month, and the syllabi sat on the kitchen counter like promises waiting to be kept. 2 days later, everything changed again. Hope had just finished her morning treatment when Dr. Chen asked to speak with both of them. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Grace had learned to read the micro-expressions of medical professionals. Something was different. The latest scans show something unexpected, Dr. Chen began, and Grace's heart dropped. But then the doctor smiled. The myelin regeneration is happening faster than we've ever seen. Hope your body isn't just accepting the treatment, it's embracing it. You're in the 15% of super responders. Hope gripped Grace's hand so hard it hurt. What does that mean? It means we're looking at the possibility of not just remission, but significant recovery. I don't want to give false hope, but if this rate continues, you could regain most of your functionality within 6 months. The room seemed to spin. Grace heard Hope asking questions about timeline, about potential, about what functionality meant, but the words washed over her like water. 6 months. After 3 years of watching her sister deteriorate, 6 months felt both impossibly long and miraculously short. That night they called Charles on video chat to share the news. He cried openly, unashamed, his joy for them pure and uncomplicated. This calls for a celebration, he declared. When you're feeling up to it, Hope, we're going to have the best dinner Boston can offer. Can we just have pizza? Hope asked. Really good pizza. I've been dreaming about cheese that doesn't come from a hospital kitchen. Charles laughed. Pizza it is. The best pizza in Boston. But when they met for dinner a week later, Charles brought more than pizza. He brought news that made Grace's hands shake as she read the documents he'd handed her. The board approved the center, he said, his eyes twinkling. With conditions, of course. Regular reports, metrics for success, all sorts of corporate nonsense. But Grace, we're building it. Ground breaks in spring. How? Grace managed to ask. I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I threatened to go public with my own story. Billionaire tests humanity's kindness, finds it lacking, except for one minimum wage waitress. Can you imagine the PR nightmare? Suddenly funding a kindness center seemed like good business. Hope laughed, the sound bright and clear. You manipulated them into doing good. Margaret always said the best revenge against small people is forcing them to be better than they are. Charles raised his glass of soda. To Margaret, who was right about everything. To Hope, who's showing us what courage looks like. And to Grace, who started all of this with a $6 cup of coffee. They clinked glasses, and Grace felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. This was what possibility felt like. This was what hope with a capital H meant. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Hope's treatments continued, each one making her stronger rather than weaker. Grace threw herself into her studies, discovering she had a natural aptitude for social work theory that surprised her professors. Charles visited regularly, and their dinners became a tradition, sometimes fancy restaurants. When Hope felt strong, sometimes takeout eaten in the hospital room when she didn't. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Hope taking her first unassisted walk around the block, tears streaming down both their faces. Grace getting her first A on a paper about systemic barriers to healthcare access. Charles bringing Margaret's photo albums, sharing stories that made her real to them, not just a saint, but a woman who burned toast and couldn't parallel park, and once accidentally dyed all his white shirts pink. One evening in November, as the first snow began to fall, they sat in the apartment, watching it dust the city in white. Hope was working on her laptop, writing what she called her sick girl memoir, though it was really a love letter to everyone who'd helped her survive. Grace was reading for class, highlighter in hand, making notes in margins. Charles dozed in the armchair they'd bought specifically for his visits, looking more peaceful than Grace had ever seen him. This is nice, Hope said suddenly. What is this? Being boring, being normal, having a Tuesday night where nothing dramatic happens. She closed her laptop and looked at Grace. We haven't had normal in so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like. Grace understood. For 3 years, every day had been a crisis or potential crisis. Every phone call could be bad news. Every symptom could be the beginning of the end. But now they had the luxury of ordinary problems, what to make for dinner, whether to watch a movie or read how to fix the squeaky bathroom door. Charles stirred, blinking awake. Did I miss anything? Just Tuesday, Hope said. You missed Tuesday being Tuesday. Perfect, he said, settling back. I haven't had a good Tuesday in years. As the snow continued to fall, Grace thought about the strange family they'd become. Not blood, but something else, people bound by kindness and struggle, and the decision to see each other fully. She thought about the center they would build, the people they would help, the ripples that would spread from one cup of coffee offered on a rainy morning. Her phone buzzed with a text from Miguel back in New York. Saw the news about the center getting approved. Save me a spot in that kitchen. Then another from Jerome at the hospital. Hope's blood work is looking amazing. Dr. Chen is using words like remarkable and unprecedented. You should be proud. And one more from a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Bennett, this is David from your social policy class. Would you want to study together for the midterm? You always have such insightful comments in discussion. Grace smiled at that last one. A study date. Such a normal college thing, something she'd missed out on the first time around. She texted back that yes, she'd like that, and felt Hope watching her with a knowing look. What? Nothing. Just nice to see you wanting things for yourself. The snow was heavier now, transforming Boston into something magical. Charles stood stretching. I should head back before the roads get bad, he said, but made no move to leave. Or you could stay, Hope suggested. The couch pulls out. We have extra blankets. You could have breakfast with us. Charles looked surprised, then touched. I wouldn't want to impose. Family doesn't impose, Grace said firmly. Family just is. He stayed. They made up the sofa bed with their best sheets, and Charles insisted on helping despite their protests. They stayed up too late talking, sharing stories, planning the center. Charles told them about a young architect he'd hired, someone who understood the vision of a building that welcomed rather than intimidated. Hope shared chapters from her memoir, making them laugh and cry in equal measure. Grace talked about her classes, the theories she was learning, the practical applications she could already envision. When they finally went to bed, Grace lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sound of Charles's gentle snoring from the living room. 6 months ago, she'd been a waitress, barely keeping her head above water. Now she was a student, a future director, a friend to a billionaire who slept on their pull-out couch because he didn't want to drive in the snow. Life she was learning didn't follow predictable patterns. Sometimes the worst things led to the best things. Sometimes strangers became family. Sometimes a cup of coffee could change everything. In the morning, she woke to the sound of laughter from the kitchen. Hope was teaching Charles to make her special pancakes, the ones where she added vanilla and cinnamon to the batter. He was wearing their father's old apron, the one that said, "Kiss the cook," in faded letters, and there was flour in his silver hair. "You're not whisking with confidence," Hope was saying, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Pancakes can sense fear." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Charles protested, but he was smiling, looking younger than his years. Grace stood in the doorway watching them. Hope, who'd spent the last 3 years in and out of hospitals, was standing at the stove without support, directing a billionaire in the art of pancake making. The morning sun streamed through the windows, turning everything golden, and Grace thought this might be what happiness looked like, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of people who made the struggle worthwhile. "Are you going to help or just stand there grinning?" Hope asked, noticing her. "Just taking it in," Grace said, joining them at the stove. "Just taking it all in." They ate pancakes at the small table, Charles declaring them the best he'd ever had, though they were slightly burned on one side. Outside, Boston was waking up to a world transformed by snow people bundling up for their commutes, life going on as it always did. But inside their small apartment, they'd created something else, a pocket of warmth and belonging that had nothing to do with money or status or even blood. "I've been thinking," Charles said, pouring more coffee, "when the center opens, we should have a dedication ceremony. Something Margaret would have loved, not stuffy or formal, but real. Maybe we serve coffee and Hope's brownies. Maybe we invite everyone who's ever been made to feel less than everyone who's ever needed kindness and didn't find it. And those who did find it," Hope added. "The ones who can tell others it exists." "We'll call it the Margaret Center," Grace said. "Is that okay?" Charles's eyes filled with tears. She would have loved that. But she would have insisted it be the Margaret and Friends Center. She never wanted anything to be just about her. "The Margaret and Friends Center for Human Kindness," Hope said, testing it out. "I like it." They spent the morning planning, dreaming out loud about what the center could be. Charles pulled up the architectural plans on his laptop, and they crowded around, suggesting changes. Hope wanted a garden on the roof, somewhere people could find peace. Grace wanted the medical floor to feel homey, not institutional. Charles wanted Margaret's portrait in the lobby, but small, humble the way she would have preferred. The snow stopped by noon, leaving the city sparkling and clean. Charles finally left after lunch, but not before making plans for Thanksgiving the following week. "I haven't cooked a turkey in 20 years, he warned. "We'll help," Grace promised. "It'll be an adventure." After he left, the sisters sat in the quiet apartment, both aware that something had shifted. They were no longer in crisis mode. They were building something. "I'm going to get better," Hope said quietly. "I can feel it. Not cured, but better. Better enough. Better enough for what? For life. For teaching. For falling in love. For traveling. For all the things I thought I'd lost forever." She fingered Margaret's bracelet, which she never took off now. "For being more than my disease." Grace hugged her sister, feeling the new strength in Hope's arms as she hugged back. They'd traveled so far from that desperate night in the pharmacy 3 years ago, when a stranger's kindness had kept them afloat. Now they were the ones in a position to offer kindness, to pass it forward, to complete the circle. That evening, Grace worked on her paper about healthcare accessibility, while Hope typed away at her memoir. The apartment was quiet, except for the clicking of keyboards and the occasional sip of tea. It was boring, beautifully boring, the kind of evening they'd once thought they'd never have again. Grace's phone lit up with a text from David about their study session, and she found herself looking forward to it. Not as an escape from her responsibilities, but as an addition to a life that was suddenly expanding in ways she'd never imagined. She thought about Charles, probably alone in his big house, but not lonely anymore, planning Thanksgiving dinner with the enthusiasm of someone who'd remembered how to care about small pleasures. She thought about the center that would soon exist, the people it would help, the ripples of kindness that would spread from it. She thought about Hope typing away at her story, turning suffering into something meaningful. And she thought about herself, Grace Bennett, who'd bought a stranger coffee and changed the trajectory of multiple lives. She was still the same person who'd stood in that coffee shop, tired and overwhelmed, choosing kindness anyway. But she was also becoming someone new, a student, a leader, a woman with a future that extended beyond mere survival. Hope looked up from her laptop. "I just wrote the part about you buying Charles coffee. About how you didn't hesitate even though you needed that money. What did you say about it? That kindness isn't measured in dollars, but in the distance between what we have and what we're willing to give, and that you've always been willing to give everything." "Not everything," Grace corrected. "I kept enough to keep us going. Enough to keep us hoping," Hope amended. "There's a difference." Outside, Boston settled into evening lights coming on in windows, lives continuing in their private dramas and quiet victories. But inside apartment 4B, two sisters sat in comfortable silence, no longer afraid of tomorrow, no longer desperate for rescue. They'd been rescued already, not by Charles's money, though that had helped, but by the recognition that kindness created its own economy, one where everyone could be rich if they chose to be. The study session with David was 3 days away. Thanksgiving was next week. The center would break ground in spring. Hope's next treatment was showing continued improvement. Life was full of markers, now points to anticipate rather than dread. Grace opened a new document on her laptop and began to write her own story. Not a memoir like Hope's, but a proposal for the center, a vision statement that would guide their work. She wrote about the woman in the pharmacy who'd paid for Hope's medication, about Charles testing humanity and finding it mostly wanting, about Marcus and Diane and everyone who'd forgotten that people were more than their bank accounts. But mostly she wrote about the people they would serve, the ones counting change for medication, the ones too proud to ask for help, the ones who needed someone to see them as more than their circumstances. The Margaret and Friends Center for Human Kindness, she typed, will operate on a simple principle. Everyone who walks through our doors will be seen valued and helped, regardless of their ability to pay. Because kindness isn't charity, it's recognition of our shared humanity. Hope read over her shoulder, nodding. Add something about the coffee shop, about how it all started. Grace thought for a moment, then typed, "The center includes a pay-it-forward café inspired by a single cup of coffee that proved kindness is contagious. Every cup purchased creates the possibility for someone else to receive what they need, not just coffee, but connection, dignity, and hope." "Perfect," Hope said. "Charles will love it." As if summoned by his name, Grace's phone rang. Charles's contact photo, a picture Hope had taken of him, flower-covered and laughing, filled the screen. "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving," he said without preamble. "What if we invited others, people from Hope's support group, from your classes, from the hospital? Margaret always said holidays were meant to be shared with whoever needed family." Grace looked at Hope, who was already nodding enthusiastically. "How many people are we talking about?" Grace asked. "As many as want to come. I'll rent a space, hire caterers." "No," Grace interrupted. "If we do this, we do it right. Margaret's way. Everyone contributes something, even if it's just their presence. No one feels like a charity case." There was a pause, then Charles's warm laugh. "You really did know her, didn't you? Without ever meeting her?" "I know you," Grace said simply, "and you're made of her influence." They talked for another hour, planning what was becoming less a dinner and more an event, the good kind, the kind where people who might otherwise be alone found themselves surrounded by chosen family. Thanksgiving arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of crisp November day that made Boston look like a postcard. The community center they'd rented was already bustling when Grace and Hope arrived, carrying trays of Hope's brownies and several pies they'd stayed up late making. Charles was there, directing volunteers with the same intensity he'd once directed board meetings, but his face was softer now, lit with purpose rather than profit. 27 confirmed guests," he announced, beaming, "including 3 families from Hope's support group, 4 international students from Grace's class who couldn't go home, and several nurses from the hospital who have to work tomorrow." Jerome was already there, helping set up tables, his warm laugh filling the space. Dr. Chen arrived with her teenage daughter, who immediately gravitated toward Hope, fascinated by her stories of the treatment. David showed up early, ostensibly to help Grace with chairs, but really she suspected just to spend time with her. He was sweet and earnest, with thick glasses and a tendency to quote obscure social theorists when nervous. "This is what Durkheim meant by collective effervescence," he said, watching people stream in. "Community forming through shared ritual. Or maybe," Grace said gently, "it's just people being kind to each other." He blushed. "That too." By noon, the space was transformed. Long tables covered with mismatched tablecloths borrowed from various homes created a patchwork of color. Everyone had brought something: food, flowers, music. An elderly man from Hope's support group, Mr. Patterson, had brought his guitar. A family from Syria whose child was in treatment at the hospital contributed a massive platter of kibbeh and fattoush that filled the air with the scent of mint and sumac. Grace watched Charles navigate the room, no trace of the billionaire visible except perhaps in the quality of his listening. He sat with Mr. Patterson, learning guitar chords. He helped the Syrian mother arrange her dishes, asking about spices and techniques. He was, Grace realized, learning how to be human again after years of being merely successful. "He's different," Hope observed, appearing at Grace's elbow. She was walking without any support now, though Grace noticed she stayed close to walls and furniture, ready to catch herself if needed. "We all are." No, but look at him. Really look. Grace did. Charles was laughing at something the Syrian family's young son had said, his whole body engaged in the joy of it. The weight he'd carried that first day in the coffee shop was still there, but it no longer bent him. He stood straighter, smiled easier, moved through the world as if he belonged in it again. Margaret would be so proud, Grace said softly. She is, Hope corrected. Wherever she is, she is. The dinner itself was chaotic and perfect. Too many people for the space, not enough matching plates, someone's aunt who talked too loudly, and someone's child who wouldn't stop crying until Hope taught him to fold napkins into swans. The Syrian father and Mr. Patterson discovered a mutual love of chess. The international students taught everyone a drinking song from their various countries, though they substituted apple cider for alcohol. Dr. Chen's daughter, Shai, at first ended up leading a group in an impromptu dance when someone found a speaker and played music. David sat next to Grace, and she found herself enjoying his company more than she'd expected. He was passionate about his studies, but also curious about her experiences, asking thoughtful questions about caregiving and class dynamics that showed he saw her as more than just a pretty face or a project. "You're not what I expected," he admitted as they cleared plates together. "What did you expect? Someone bitter, maybe, or exhausted. You've been through so much, but you're still open." Grace considered this. "I was bitter for a while, and I'm definitely exhausted. But Hope taught me that you can be tired and still choose joy. You can be hurt and still choose kindness. The choice is what matters." Across the room, she caught Charles watching them with a small smile. He raised his glass of cider in a silent toast, and she understood the message: be happy. Choose this. Margaret would want you to choose this. After dinner, Mr. Patterson played his guitar, while people sang songs everyone half remembered from childhood. The Syrian children performed a traditional dance they'd learned from their grandmother. Jerome told stories from his childhood in Haiti that had everyone alternately laughing and wiping away tears. And Hope, brave Hope, stood up and read a passage from her memoir. "I used to think strength meant not needing anyone." She read, her voice clear and strong. "I thought independence was the highest virtue, that asking for help was admitting defeat. But this disease taught me that strength is knowing when to lean. Independence is choosing who to lean on, and asking for help is the bravest thing we do. Every person in this room has been my strength when I had none. You've been my legs when mine wouldn't work, my hope when mine ran out. That's not weakness. That's the most profound kind of love." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Charles was openly weeping, not trying to hide it. Grace held Hope's hand, feeling the steadiness in it, the strength that had been building week by week. Even David, who'd known them only briefly, was touched by the raw honesty of it. As the evening wound down, Charles stood to speak. Grace had seen him give speeches to boards and shareholders, smooth presentations designed to persuade and impress. This was different. He stood there vulnerable and real, his voice catching on the first words. "My wife Margaret believed in multiplication," he began. "Not the mathematical kind, though she was good at that too. She believed kindness multiplied, that one act of generosity created ripples that became waves. 6 months ago, I thought she was wrong. I thought the world had become too hard, too cynical for that kind of magic." He looked directly at Grace. "Then a young woman bought me a cup of coffee when I needed more than coffee, when I needed proof that Margaret was right. And look what multiplied from that single act." He gestured around the room at the unlikely gathering of people from different worlds, different struggles, all connected by threads of kindness and care. In the spring, we'll break ground on the Margaret and Friends Center for Human Kindness. But looking around this room, I realize the center already exists. It exists in every choice to see each other, to help without calculating the return, to build family from friendship and friendship from compassion. You are all the center. You're what Margaret believed in. Someone started clapping, then everyone was not the polite applause of formal events, but the genuine celebration of people who'd witnessed something real. Charles sat down quickly, embarrassed by the attention, but glowing with something that looked like peace. The party broke up slowly, people reluctant to leave the warmth of connection. Grace found herself walking David to the door, aware of Hope and Charles watching, with poorly hidden interest. "This was amazing," David said, shuffling his feet. Would you want to get coffee sometime, to study, I mean? Or not to study? Just coffee." Grace thought about coffee, about how it had started everything, about the perfect circles life sometimes made. "I'd like that." He smiled, bright and genuine, and Grace felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or obligation, and everything to do with possibility. As they cleaned up, Charles quiet and content, Hope practically glowing with the success of the evening, Grace thought about the strange mathematics of kindness. One coffee had become a medical treatment, had become a center, had become this room full of people who might never have met otherwise. Margaret had been right about multiplication. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a blur of continued improvement. Hope's treatments were working beyond anyone's best expectations. She was walking unassisted for longer periods, her handwriting steadying the fog that had clouded her thinking for months, finally lifting. Dr. Chen was cautiously optimistic about reducing the treatment intensity after the new year. Grace threw herself into her studies with renewed energy, finding that her experiences gave her insights her younger classmates lacked. Her professors began recommending additional readings, suggesting she consider graduate school possibilities that would have seemed laughable 6 months ago. Her coffee dates with David evolved from study sessions to actual dates. He was nothing like what she'd imagined for herself, shy, where she'd expected confident theoretical, where she'd wanted practical, but he made her laugh, and he saw her not as a caregiver or a victim of circumstance, but as someone whole and complex and worth knowing deeply. Charles divided his time between Boston and New York, overseeing the center's development. The architectural plans had evolved based on their Thanksgiving experience, more communal spaces, a teaching kitchen where people could share recipes and cultures, a children's area designed by the Syrian family's son, who declared himself an important architect at age 7. 2 weeks before Christmas, Charles called with news that made Grace sit down hard on the apartment's worn couch. "The Sterling Cup board voted," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "about Marcus." Grace waited, her heart pounding. "He's been removed from his position. But Grace, he's asked to meet with you, to apologize properly. You don't have to." "I'll meet him," Grace said, surprising herself. The meeting was scheduled for the next day in the lobby of a neutral hotel. Grace arrived to find Marcus already there, and for a moment she didn't recognize him. He looked smaller, somehow diminished. The sharp suits were gone, replaced by ordinary clothes that made him look like what he'd always been, a middle-aged man, afraid of being insignificant. "Thank you for coming," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Grace sat across from him, waiting. She'd learned the power of silence from Hope's illness, how sometimes the most important things emerged only when you stopped filling the space with words. "I've been thinking," Marcus finally said, "about that day. About a lot of days, actually. You were right. I wasn't sorry for what I did. I was sorry I got caught." He looked up then, and Grace saw something she'd never expected in his eyes, genuine shame. But I am now. Sorry for what I did, I mean. What changed? Marcus laughed bitterly. I lost everything. The job, the status, the people I thought were friends. Turns out they only liked me when I could do something for them. I've been working at a regular coffee shop, not a chain, just a small place in Queens. The owner doesn't know who I used to be. Last week a kid came in, couldn't afford his order. And I almost did it again, almost sent him away. Then I thought about you. About how easy it would have been to just be kind. Did you be kind? I paid for his coffee. He cried. Turns out he'd just been to a job interview, his first one, and he'd spent his last money on a bus ticket to get there. Marcus shook his head. Such a small thing, but it mattered so much to him. I think I finally understood what I'd been missing. They talked for another hour. Not as friends, Grace didn't think they'd ever be that, but as humans who'd intersected at a crucial moment and changed each other's trajectories. Marcus had enrolled in community college, studying to become a social worker himself. It was almost too perfect, too neat, but Grace had learned that life sometimes wrote better stories than fiction. I won't ask for forgiveness, Marcus said, as they prepared to leave. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that what you did that day, standing up to me, choosing kindness even when I was cruel, it mattered. It changed me, eventually. Grace thought about Margaret's multiplication theory. Even Marcus, the opposite of kindness, had been changed by witnessing it. The ripples really did keep spreading. Christmas approached with a kind of anticipation Grace hadn't felt since childhood. They were returning to New York for 2 weeks. Hope was stable enough to travel, and there were meetings about the center that needed Grace's input. Charles had invited them to stay at his apartment, but they'd politely declined, not ready to give up the independence they'd fought so hard to maintain. Instead, they were staying in their old apartment, which Mrs. Moose Chen had kept aired out and clean. The plane descended through clouds into a New York transformed by snow and holiday lights. Hope pressed her face to the window like a child marveling at the city that had been their entire world for so long. It looks smaller, she said. Is that weird? Or we got bigger? Grace suggested. Their old apartment felt like a museum of their former lives. Everything exactly where they'd left it, but somehow different, like returning to your elementary school and finding the hallways narrower than memory. Hope walked through the rooms, slowly touching things, the couch, where she'd spent so many sick days, the kitchen table where Grace had spread medical bills like tarot cards predicting disaster, the window where she'd hung the crystal that caught light. We were so scared here, Hope said softly. Every single day we were terrified. We were surviving, Grace corrected. And we did. We survived. That evening, Charles took them to see the building that would become the Margaret and Friends Center. It was a beautiful old structure that had been a department store in the 1920s, with good bones and huge windows that would flood the spaces with light. Standing in what would be the café, Grace could almost see it. People at tables, conversations over coffee, the sound of the espresso machine like a heartbeat keeping time. The café will be the heart of it, Charles said, pointing to architectural plans spread on a makeshift table. Not hidden or secondary, but the first thing people see, because it all started with coffee. Hope was exploring the second floor, which would house the medical facilities. Her voice echoed down the empty stairwell. There should be windows between the treatment rooms and the children's area, so parents can watch their kids play during procedures. Write it down, Charles called back, smiling. The architects love her, he told Grace. She's sent them 12 pages of suggestions based on her experiences. They said it's the most useful feedback they've ever received. David had come to New York for the holidays too, ostensibly to visit family, but really Grace knew to see her. They went ice skating in Central Park, Grace clutching his arm and laughing as they both struggled to stay upright. He met Hope properly, the two of them immediately bonding over obscure literary references Grace didn't understand. He even had dinner with Charles, who interrogated him with the thoroughness of a father, though he had no right to that role. "He's good for you," Charles said afterward. "He sees you." Everyone keeps saying that people see me, but I think what matters more is that I'm finally letting myself be seen. Christmas Eve found them all at Charles's penthouse, after all, not as guests, but as family gathering for the holiday. The space was magnificent, but warm, filled with photos of Margaret books on every surface, and a tree that Hope had insisted on decorating with handmade ornaments from the hospital gift shop. Jerome came bringing his mother, who told stories of Haiti that made them all lean in closer. Dr. Chen stopped by with her daughter, and news that Hope's latest tests were so positive they were submitting her case for publication. Miguel from the Sterling Cup arrived with his family, and enough food to feed twice their number. Even Mrs. Chen from their old building came clutching a photo album she'd made of the sisters, over the years candid shots taken when they hadn't noticed Grace helping Hope down the stairs, Hope laughing at something on her laptop, the two of them on the stoop sharing a single ice cream cone. "You were my family when my own family was far away," Mrs. Chen said, pressing the album into their hands. "Let me document your journey." As midnight approached, they gathered around Charles's piano, which no one had played since Margaret died. Hope, it turned out, could play a little something she'd learned in high school but hadn't mentioned in years. She played simple carols while everyone sang, her hands steady on the keys, no tremor visible. Grace stood between David and Charles, watching her sister make music, and felt something complete in her chest. Not happiness exactly, though that was there. Not contentment, though that too. It was the feeling of arrival, of having traveled through darkness and found not just light, but a whole constellation of connections. "Next year," Charles said quietly, "the center will be open. We'll have Christmas there, invite everyone who needs somewhere to go." "It'll be chaos," Grace warned. "It'll be perfect," Hope called from the piano. "Perfectly imperfect, like all the best things." The clock struck midnight, officially Christmas, and snow began to fall outside the massive windows. They all moved to watch it, this group of unlikely family survivors and thrivers, connected by threads of kindness that had woven themselves into something unbreakable. Grace's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her look. "Thank you for showing me that kindness multiplies. My son got the job. We're having Christmas for the first time in 3 years. Marcus." She showed it to Charles, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Even him," he said wonderingly. "Even someone like him can change." "Everyone can change," Hope said, joining them at the window. "That's what grace is, the space to become better than we were." "Is that from your memoir?" David asked. "No," Hope said, linking arms with her sister. "That's from Grace. She taught me that. She teaches everyone that just by being herself." Later. Much later, after everyone had gone home and Hope was asleep in one of Charles's guest rooms, Grace stood alone at the window, watching the snow fall on the city. David had kissed her goodnight at the door, shy and sweet. Charles had hugged her and called her the daughter he'd never had. Hope had whispered that this was the best Christmas of her life, better even than the ones before their parents died. But it was a message on her phone that made Grace cry, a photo from the community center in Boston, where they'd had Thanksgiving. Someone had gone back and written on the wall in beautiful script, "The Margaret and Friends Center began here with a meal shared by strangers who became family. May all who enter find the same." Grace thought about the coffee shop where it had really begun, about the moment she'd chosen to see Charles rather than look through him. Such a small choice, a tiny pivot point, but it had changed everything. Her phone rang. Charles calling from his bedroom. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "I keep thinking about Margaret, about what she'd say if she could see all this." "What do you think she'd say?" "I think she'd say it was about time. That I'd been holding all this love inside, afraid to let it out because I might lose it. But love isn't like money. You can't save it. You have to spend it, give it away, let it multiply." She was a wise woman. She would have loved you and Hope so much. His voice broke a little. She always wanted daughters. Said sons were fine, but daughters were magic. She would have claimed you both, you know. Made you call her mom. "We would have," Grace said, meaning it. "We would have loved to call her mom." They talked until the sky began to lighten about the center, about Hope's continued improvement, about the strange and wonderful turns their lives had taken. Finally, Charles said, "You know what day it is, Christmas. The first Christmas in years that feels like Christmas." "Why, Tom?" "Because I have family again. Because I have something to give that matters. Because Margaret's dream is coming true just differently than we imagined." Grace thought about that as she finally drifted off to sleep in the guest room, Hope breathing steadily in the bed next to hers. Different than imagined. That was the story of all their lives, now different than imagined, but better, richer, more connected. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a whirlwind of meetings about the center. Contractors, social workers, medical professionals, all contributing ideas to make the vision reality. Hope attended every meeting, her insights invaluable. She'd become the unofficial voice of the patients, the one who could explain what dignity looked like from a hospital bed, what hope felt like when your body betrayed you. David extended his stay, spending days with Grace as she navigated the complexity of turning kindness into infrastructure. He was good at systems, at seeing how things connected, at spotting potential problems before they became actual ones. "You should hire him," Hope suggested one evening, "for the center. You'll need someone who understands both the theory and the practice." Grace had been thinking the same thing, but worried about mixing personal and professional. Then she looked at Charles, who'd built an empire with Margaret at his side, and thought maybe that was exactly the point, to work with people you loved toward something you believed in. New Year's Eve arrived with another party, this one at the building that would become the center. Charles had somehow gotten permission to hold it in the unfinished space, and they'd strung lights everywhere, set up heaters, created magic in what was essentially a construction site. Everyone came. Everyone. The Syrian family from Thanksgiving, Jerome and his mother, Dr. Chen Miguel, and his family, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Patterson, with his guitar, the international students, even some of the construction workers who'd been moved by the vision of what they were building. Grace had hesitantly invited her old co-workers from the Sterling Cup, and to her surprise, several came, including Diane. "I've been thinking," Diane said, approaching Grace with visible discomfort. "About that day, about a lot of days. I wasn't a good person. I'm probably still not. But I want to be better." It was becoming a theme, Grace thought, people wanting to be better. Maybe that's what the center would really be about. Not just helping those in crisis, but creating space for everyone to practice being their best selves. As midnight approached, Charles clinked a spoon against his glass, calling for attention. 6 months ago, he began. I was a bitter old man, testing humanity and finding it wanting. Tonight, I stand here surrounded by proof that I was wrong, that Margaret was right, that kindness lives and breathes and multiplies when we give it room to grow. He raised his glass. To Grace, who bought a stranger coffee and started a revolution of kindness. To Hope, who shows us daily that strength comes in many forms. To all of you who've chosen to be part of something bigger than yourselves. To Margaret, Grace called out, raising her own glass, who believed in this before any of us knew it was possible. To Margaret, everyone echoed, and Grace could have sworn she felt a presence warm and approving, like sun on her face. The countdown began. David took Grace's hand. Hope stood between them and Charles, her arms linked with both. Around them, their unlikely family of chosen and choosing people counted down to a new year. 3, 2, 1. The cheer that went up could probably be heard blocks away. Kisses were exchanged. Hugs lasted longer than usual, and someone had managed to rig confetti cannons that exploded in gold and silver. But Grace barely noticed the chaos. She was looking at the wall where someone had hung the architectural rendering of the completed center. At the bottom, Hope had written in her careful handwriting, "No one should have to earn kindness." It was perfect. It was everything. "This is our year," Hope said, squeezing Grace's hand. "The year we stop surviving and start thriving." "The year the center opens," Charles added. "The year Margaret's dream becomes reality. The year we all become who we were meant to be," David said, shy but certain. Grace looked around the room at the construction site that would become a beacon, at the people who'd become family, at her sister. Standing strong and steady at Charles, who'd found purpose again, at David, who saw her truly. "The year kindness wins," she said simply. And in that moment, in that unfinished building, full of infinite possibility, surrounded by people who'd chosen love over indifference, Grace knew it was true. They'd already won. Every cup of coffee shared, every hand extended, every choice to see rather than look through, they'd already changed the world. The center was just the physical manifestation of something that had been building since that rainy morning when she'd chosen to buy a stranger coffee. Later, much later, as people began to drift home and the new year settled into its first quiet hours, Charles pulled Grace and Hope aside. "I have something for you," he said, producing 2 envelopes. "Open them together." Inside were adoption papers. Not legal, they were both adults, but symbolic. Charles had created documents declaring them his daughters in heart, if not law, complete with rights to visit, obligations to call, and a standing invitation to Sunday dinners. "It's silly," he said suddenly, uncertain. "Margaret would have done something more elegant." Hope threw herself at him, hugging him with strength that surprised them all. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This whole impossible, beautiful thing is perfect." Grace joined the hug, and they stood there in the middle of the construction site, 3 people who'd been alone in different ways, now fundamentally connected. "Margaret has daughters," Charles whispered. "She always wanted daughters, and now she has them." As they finally prepared to leave, Grace took one last look around the space. In 5 months, it would open. The café would serve its first cup of coffee. The medical clinic would treat its first patient. The support groups would hold their first meetings. The multiplication of kindness would have a physical address. But it had already begun. It was in Marcus starting over with humility, in Diane questioning her assumptions, in Hope getting stronger every day, in Charles learning to love again, in David seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary, in Grace herself understanding finally that kindness wasn't weakness, but the greatest strength of all. "Ready?" Hope asked, linking arms with her. "Ready," Grace said. They walked out into the first morning of the new year, snow crunching under their feet, the city just beginning to wake. Behind them, the building stood waiting to become what it was meant to be. Ahead, the future stretched out like a gift waiting to be unwrapped. "You know what I love most about our story," Hope said as they walked. "What? It's not ending, it's just beginning." She was right, Grace thought. Every ending was just a doorway to another beginning. Every cup of coffee shared might start another revolution. Every kindness, no matter how small, had the potential to change everything. The sun was rising now, painting the snow-covered city in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful and harsh, welcoming and indifferent, full of millions of people who might need kindness or might offer it might be one cup of coffee away from their own transformation. Grace thought about the café that would soon exist, the sign Hope had designed that would hang in the window. "The first cup is always free, the second is paid forward." She thought about the people who would walk through those doors, tired caregivers, struggling families, lonely seniors, sick children, billionaires, testing humanity, humans being human in all their messy, beautiful complexity. She thought about Margaret, the woman she'd never met, but felt she knew, whose belief in kindness had survived even death, multiplying through Charles, through them, through everyone their story touched. And she thought about that morning, not even 7 months ago, when she'd made a choice that seemed small at the time to see a person in distress and help simply because she could. "Grace," Hope said, pulling her from her thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" "Coffee," Grace said, smiling. "I'm thinking about coffee." Hope laughed bright and clear in the morning air. "Of course you are. It all comes back to coffee." "No," Grace corrected, squeezing her sister's arm. "It all comes back to kindness. Coffee was just the beginning." They walked on through the waking city, two sisters who'd found family in unexpected places, who'd learned that wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with connection, who'd discovered that the smallest gestures could create the biggest changes. Behind them, their footprints in the snow were already being covered by new falling flakes. But ahead the path was clear, leading toward home, toward the future, toward the grand opening of the Margaret and Friends Center for Human Kindness, where no one would ever have to earn what should be freely given, where coffee would flow like grace, and where the multiplication of kindness would continue, one cup, one connection, one transformed life at a time.